have the first question, please?
Joe Nagy from the committee. Just before I begin my question, I want you to know where I'm coming from. My mother was subject to a lot of domestic violence. I grew up as a kid, so some of the things that you talked about, I understand very well. The second point I want to make is this. Isn't the reason why, and you've all talked about what's happening, but you haven't explained what we can do about it. I'm going to offer you a suggestion on this. Isn't the reason why domestic violence continues to be a horrible problem that is worsening rather than getting better is because women are classified as second citizens. And proof of that, if you want to argue with me, I'll argue with you all day on this one, is look at their salary differences, look at the fact that their position in society and business or wherever it is subjugated to men. There's not as many women out there doing this. There's not as many women in police forces and so forth, or judges. That's what the problem is. They're not getting a fair shake from society, and it's our fault, all of us here, that we aren't putting pressure on our governments. And one final point, just think about our first woman prime minister and what she put up with. And that idiot became the prime minister who did that to her. That's a disgrace.
I go, woo, I totally agree. Yeah. I think that there's, heaps of research to show that violence against women is a cause and a consequence of gender inequality.
How did you find out how to do it?
So I'm with you. Yeah.
I would also like to add, because I bring a class analysis to my work. I grew up in poverty. That the general cruelty in society towards people, the understanding that we are not all equal, we do not care for each other, we have inferiors and superiors. It is okay to leave people living in poverty and to have people living in extraordinary wealth, brings in the capacity for cruelty, demeaning behaviour, and also for rage, intergenerational rage.
I haven't experienced any domestic violence, and I would like to see the man that would make me subject to such. But I'm wondering whether the high statistic of Aboriginals' violence, compared even to the rest of the population, could that be that the police actually concentrate on looking for it in those women? A subsidiary question is, how do Australian statistics compare to international ones?
Okay, so I guess when you actually take the second question first, when you look at the statistics within Australia compared to, the international data, so there was the World Health Organization did an international study that looked at, the international prevalence of violence against women across numerous countries in the world. And so Australia had a particular component within that, was a country that participated in that study. And the results are pretty similar to other comparative countries. So, and I guess I want to sort of comment on what Christine said. So when you actually look at, the sort of intersection of gendered inequality with other forms of oppression, racism, classism, etc., you tend to see higher rates of violence when you've got a more patriarchal system, when you've got a more classist system, when you've got a more racist system. So if you look at rates of violence in other comparative countries like, the UK, New Zealand, the US, Canada, similar rates of violence. Yeah.
I'd also like to add that the research on the neurology of trauma, which I started getting into in 1997, just before I set up the Women's Refuge, was enormously helpful in helping survivors to understand their own behaviour and how much control or lack of control they had over their own behaviour. So I would say that for groups in society that have experienced multiple traumas, and especially trauma across the generations, so you're certainly looking at Indigenous populations that have been traumatised generation after generation, their development from the time they were small children is very, very much affected. So I would say that that's part of it as well. The fact that they are affected and don't have a lot of control over the effect of trauma on their brain's development.
Yeah, thanks very much to the panel. Very interesting talks. I just wanted to ask about the whole question of, which was mentioned by one of the speakers, about neoliberalism and government policies which are attacking policies that attack women in various different ways. By the way, I think we should give a call out of support to the it's a related topic, the members of the childcare people have gone on strike today to try and get equal pay, which is just a fundamental point. Without getting something like that, we're not going to see advancement in a whole lot of different areas. So I think that was a very important thing that they've done today. But I actually want to give a plug for the sheet which is being passed around, and people should have a read of it. It's a related topic of what's happening to the rape crisis centres, because both the federal and state governments are rampant neoliberal operators who are trying to privatise everything, and they're trying to privatise women's services in every area. And one of the most critical ones is the rape crisis, phone lines and so on. And if people have a look at this, they can see, by the way, there's an article in Green Left about that as well. Please get a copy before you go. So I'd like the panel to comment on this problem of the privatisation of these services, and it's actually leading to a reduction in services and attempts to make profit. By the way, Medibank is trying to make profit out of the Medibank Private is trying to make profit out of the rape crisis services, and union-based services have actually withdrawn from that. So if people could comment on that, please.
I've got a nice little grassroots example of that. I'm a member of the Coalition for Women's Refuges that have this campaign that's been building to try to restore women's refuges as feminist women's refuges with the care that we used to be able to provide. Now, we were contacted by an organisation, by a refuge, one of the few that was still standing, who had a psychologist, private psychologist, volunteer to work with them. And then he became very active, and then he went on their board, and they've reached out for support because now he and his colleagues are taking it over to run it as a private business. Wow. I remember, a few years ago when there was a lot of discussion in the media and in government about, businesses should be doing more to support our community services. They can contribute too. And everyone said, yeah, this is wonderful. Yes, they should. And then we have the model from America coming through to Australia, where community services are run by the big charities, they're run by big private businesses, and that suits government very, very well.
Okay, I want to talk to you about the technical stuff. I was formerly a social worker from Sydney University, trained by Stuart Rees. Stuart is not around. I was social worker for more than 20 years with horrible Centrelink. I sort of disowned it after leaving it. Okay, I used to hand out a lot of what do you call it now? The special payment, one-off payment for sole parent living a DV. And I used to do, towards the end, I was doing about 8 a day throughout the whole country. No idea about the geographical situation. At least in Sydney, I know where the refuges are, and I could try and ring around, beg them to house, the client. Now, the problem also is that I don't know, I've left 6 years ago. Has the situation become worse? The difficulty also sometimes if non-English speaking woman, Muslim woman, Chinese woman, is very, very difficult, but you have no choice but to put them in mainstream ones. And women that has got older boys, it's very hard for them to be rehoused, and they have to be split out. And also there are a few domestic violence cases with male, but they are few and far between, next to impossible to find any refuge. So you do on the treadmill, ringing around and getting nowhere. Towards the end of my career, I was doing all this 8 to 10 once per day, churning out like a sausage machine in the factory. In fact, nowadays social work is online and no personal contact. The problem is that you don't know what are the local services, but yet we are told to do that and churn it out, and that creates that difficulty of putting people somewhere that you have no knowledge about. So these are some of my remembrance from 6 years ago, since after retirement, and I'm glad that I'm not in it anymore. But the problem the question I want to ask is, has the situation become worse since then?
I'll give you some examples. So, there was a woman who applied to go into our block of units, and she had been offered accommodation. She actually showed me the photograph, and I've got it on a PowerPoint presentation. It was some structures built on the top of a single floor dwelling. The single floor dwelling, it was sort of like a block covered with graffiti, and the shambolic structure was on top of it with clotheslines. Part of it were single bedrooms. There were 5 of them, and on the other part, across the top of the roof, there was a kitchen and bathroom. There were 4 men living there, and she was taken there after being released from hospital. She had a fractured jaw and a broken wrist to stay there. She gave me that photograph. I made great use of that photograph. Unfortunately, we were full. We couldn't find anything for her, and she was the one that we actually managed to get 2 nights accommodation in a local motel while we desperately tried to find somewhere for her. She had to travel quite a distance out of Sydney to get accommodation. That's one. Another one was a woman who had lost her children as a result of domestic violence and not being able to keep them safe and keep herself safe. So the children were briefly put into care. She was put into a large inner city homelessness service. It was a big building, and one floor was men and the next floor was women. And they had women living in dormitories. There were 5 or 6 to a dormitory. They had mental health issues. They had drug and alcohol issues. And every morning, this woman who'd lost her children come out of this domestic violence relationship. It was a relationship where she was desperately trying to support a perpetrator who had a lot of problems, very, very sad childhood. And every morning, she would have to get up and wander around the city until late afternoon. This was in winter, because she wasn't allowed to stay there during the day. We actually managed to bring her into our block of units. We worked with her for a couple of years. She got her children back. She got her life back on track. So that's some examples of homelessness services.
I'd just like to add that from the research that we did with refuge workers, I can think of one particular story where a worker said that she spoke to a woman who basically said to her, look, I'm now in a refuge. He told me it was going to be a horrible place for me to go. He told me that it was going to be absolutely diabolical, that the children were going to experience further trauma. That's what I'm actually experiencing. She described how she was now in a refuge that had other generalist homelessness issues. So there were women who had lots of mental health issues. And basically a woman had told this refuge worker that she felt it was just a lot more predictable and safer for her to basically go home where she knew what to expect. She knew she'd be subjected to violence, but she felt that she had more control and there was more predictability around that for her children than there was remaining in the refuge amongst women who had mental health issues, drug and alcohol issues. The other thing that was really clear is that all the refuge workers we interviewed, they were definitely saying, women who have general homelessness issues need to be respected, treated with dignity. They need to have their own homelessness services that are tailor-made to suit their needs. But that the really loud message that came through was that mixing women who have already experienced a high degree of trauma and their children in these really highly unpredictable environments just created just a ridiculous situation. And they, just in answer to your question, I would say that every woman that we interviewed that has worked in a refuge before and after the reform would say that it's worse now than it's ever been.
Yeah, thank you for the informative and alarming talk. Okay, just reading some stats. Some violence against women in Australia is at levels described as a national epidemic. 2 women are murdered by their male partners in Australia every week. My question, how do you explain the discrepancy between spending hundreds of millions of dollars extra on the war on terrorism, and whenever there is the slightest threat of terrorism, funding can always be found to combat that, where seemingly there was no funding before, with the fact that women are still being turned away from services because of the lack of funds, and independent women's refuges are closing, and remaining ones are subject to privatised competitive tendering?
Because women and children escaping domestic violence and trying to survive domestic violence and needing support are no threat to those in power.
Fear-mongering, I think, gets you elected.
I'd just like to say, even though I'm not a speaker, that I think it's because the people making the decisions are men. And they like playing with their war toys. And they like playing their games. And they couldn't care less about the women.
And isn't violence against women terrorism?
Maybe there should be some. No, I don't mean that. Okay, Joffrey.
Good evening, I'm Joffrey, and from the committee. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for sharing us your insights and experience. My dad used to warn me that when poverty knocks on the door, love flies out of the window. And I think a lot of the sources of domestic violence, even from I raised 2 nephews and a niece when my sister and her husband separated, and she eventually she succumbed to cancer. And I did experience the difficulty because there was domestic violence involved as well. And I think it is because of economic hardships. Fortunately, at that time, I had a good paying job, which afforded me to raise 3 children, even if they weren't my own. And so my question really is with regard to the economic framework in dealing with domestic violence. And I'd like your comment on if there were a universal basic income approach to this, and it would provide definitely economic autonomy, economic financial autonomy to the mother and her children. Would that be do you think that would lead to a substantial reduction in domestic violence, especially now. I think as the economy doesn't look very promising up ahead. When the economy grows worse, we can expect even worse, worsening rate of domestic violence. So, I'd like your opinion on that. Thank you.
Organisation is also includes a community centre, and we see a lot of men through the work development orders, in particular, and we have a counsellor, a male counsellor that works a lot with men who are struggling with unemployment, struggling with in trying to find work and what industries they may work in, a lot of work. So I would say that stresses on men in the present day trying to keep a family afloat, and the bullying that they experience can have an effect. Also, those kind of stresses can lead to attempts to try to get some enjoyment in life and to get some pleasure out of life. It can lead to propensity to abuse alcohol and drugs in order to be able to cope with these stresses. There is some evidence that that higher rates of alcohol abuse is allied with higher rates of domestic violence. Certainly, I think the universal income. I think that that over time, as the generations find that they're not competing with each other, they're not, they aren't subjected to policy cruelty, economic cruelty, then yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's a really complex issue. You just reminded me of a really interesting study that kind of, well, the first thing I'll say is that I think definitely if a woman has more access to increased economic means, she obviously can make decisions that she may not be able to make if she doesn't have access to economic means. So I think that is a really important point that you make. There was also a really interesting study that was done that sort of looked at women's income comparable to their sort of housework related domestic duties. And I think this is where sort of the intersection between gender, class, culture is actually quite difficult to sort of untangle. Because it actually showed that women who had the highest rates of income did the greatest levels of domestic chores around the house. So it was actually quite interesting that you had these women who were at the highest sort of pay levels, but actually felt that they needed to actually come home and be, the good mother. And I think that's actually quite interesting. Just that whole sort of notion about how we as a society construct what is a good mother, what is a good wife, what is a good woman. And sometimes I think even women who have really high income levels sort of talk about feeling that, they're failing in those other respects in their life. So I think absolutely having access to an income puts a woman in a different decision-making space. But I think even women who have access to high income experience domestic violence and experience sort of societal pressures about how they should behave and what social norms they should actually adhere to. So I think that whole issue around gender, culture, class is really quite complicated and quite entangled.
My thought was about education and the men, both at schools and also could be at religious institutions, churches, mosques, synagogues, or whatever. I think just wondering what you're thinking, that men should, or boys or men should stop thinking their girlfriend or the boyfriend or their wife or future, the husband, is not their possession. It is a soulmate, a companion for a period of time, but we don't have a right to rule over.
Our domestic violence counsellor has been trained in a program called Love Bites, and it operates in local schools. It runs over 2 days, and she's one of the volunteers for that program. They run it 3 times a year in the Southern Shire, and I'm sure they run it elsewhere, going into the schools and talking about power relationships, respectful relationships, signs of control, signs of abuse. It seems very successful, and certainly the students engage with it very, very well.
Yeah, I do. I just want to say that I think one of the things that I've seen recently in terms of some of the public policy shift has been towards thinking about how do we actually create programs that actually put more of a spotlight on people who perpetrate domestic violence, and thinking about how do you actually kind of engage them in some sort of meaningful dialogue that might actually inspire them or motivate them to actually change. And I think that's a really welcome, I mean, it's a very challenging area, but I think that's a welcome change. I used to be a child protection worker, and I really saw the effects of this kind of emphasis on mothers really starkly, where it would be, as a child protection worker, you'd often go out and speak to a woman and go, look, this is how domestic violence affects your children. It's really terrible. But there was a practice that didn't really even engage with men. So oftentimes no one would actually go out and speak to the man about his behavior, have the same kind of conversation with him about this is how it affects your children. What are you going to do about it? So there's a kind of an interesting move in the child protection sphere to actually thinking about the use of domestic violence in families as a fathering choice, as a parenting choice that a man makes, and trying to engage with men on that level to think about, you might not be in a place right now to think about how this is impacting on your partner, but think about how this is impacting on your children. And so it's putting a lot more sort of responsibility on men to be accountable for their behavior, which I think is a really welcome shift. Yeah.
Okay, so can we, thank our speakers for coming tonight and for getting through the circumstances of having no sound in the first part. I think it's been a very worthwhile evening and very informative. I'd like to thank you all for coming as well, because it's always, the audience is everything really. And just to tell you what's on next week, which will actually be Stuart Rees, who's speaking. It's the cruelty in public policy in Australia, Israel, USA and Saudi Arabia, and how to respond. And Professor Stuart Rees and Dr. Vasey Vasna are speaking on that next week here. Thank you.